In January 2026, Princess Catherine stood inside a London hospital ward, thanking the doctors who had spent a year fighting to save her life. 12 months earlier, she couldn't have imagined making this trip at all. Back then, the future Queen consort was still recovering, still healing, still trying to understand what her body had been through. Now she was walking through the corridors of Charing Cross Hospital in West London, meeting nurses, shaking hands with healthcare staff, marking 1 full year since she had told the world that her cancer was in remission. It was a quiet visit. No fanfare, no grand announcement, just a woman returning to say thank you to the people who had helped her survive. But that quiet visit told a much bigger story, one about resilience, about family, about a royal household that had spent nearly 2 years rebuilding itself out of the public eye while the rest of the world speculated, worried, and waited for news. Watching her that day, you would never have guessed just how far she had traveled to get there. There was no entourage trailing behind her for effect, no carefully staged photo opportunity designed to dominate the next morning's front pages. It was the kind of visit that could have gone almost unnoticed if nobody had been paying attention, and yet for anyone who had followed her story closely, it meant everything. A year earlier, the idea of Catherine standing upright in a hospital corridor, laughing with staff, asking about their work, would have felt almost unimaginable. She had spent that earlier year hidden from public view entirely, her name appearing in headlines built on rumor rather than fact, her actual condition known only to a small circle of family and medical professionals. The distance between those two moments, the frightened uncertainty of early 2024 and the calm gratitude of January 2026, is really the entire story worth telling here. To understand how significant that January visit really was, you have to go back to where this all began. Catherine's last carefree public appearance came on Christmas morning in 2023, when she joined the rest of the royal family for their traditional walk to church at Sandringham. She looked well, she looked happy. Nobody watching that day had any idea what was coming. Just weeks later, in mid-January 2024, Kensington Palace announced that Catherine had undergone planned abdominal surgery. The statement was carefully worded, vague enough to avoid speculation, but specific enough to explain her absence from public life. She was expected to remain out of the spotlight for months while she recovered. At the time, nobody outside the palace walls knew the full truth. It would be another 2 months before that truth became public. In the meantime, the vacuum left by official silence was filled with speculation of every kind imaginable, some of it harmless curiosity, much of it far crueler than anything a family recovering from a health crisis should have had to endure. Newspapers ran competing theories. Social media users treated her absence like a puzzle to be solved rather than a private medical matter deserving basic human decency. For a woman already facing one of the most frightening chapters of her life, that swirl of public guessing games added a second burden on top of the first, the burden of having to process devastating news while the entire world argued about where she was and why. That period also exposed something uncomfortable about how modern royal watching works. The family's traditional instinct toward privacy, an instinct that has served past generations reasonably well, collided head-on with a media and social environment that no longer tolerates silence gracefully. Every unexplained absence becomes a mystery to be cracked. Every blurry photograph becomes evidence in some imagined narrative. Catherine and William found themselves navigating that collision in real time, trying to protect their children from a story that was unfolding faster than they could control it. In March 2024, Catherine appeared in a video message that stunned the nation. Sitting quietly, speaking directly to camera, she revealed that cancer had been discovered during her abdominal surgery and that she was now undergoing preventative chemotherapy. It was one of the most personal statements ever released by a senior royal, a rare and deeply human moment from a family that has spent centuries guarding its privacy. The announcement ended months of wild speculation, some of it cruel, much of it fueled by a photo editing controversy that had only made things worse in the weeks before her diagnosis became known. Suddenly, the country understood. This wasn't about secrecy for the sake of image control. This was about a mother of 3 trying to process devastating news while protecting her children from a media storm. What followed was a year that tested Catherine in ways the public rarely got to see in detail. She began her course of preventative chemotherapy in late February of 2024, and for months she stayed almost entirely out of public view. She wasn't attending ribbon cuttings or gallery openings. She was fighting for her health, quietly, at home, surrounded by her husband and her 3 children. When she did resurface, even briefly, it became a major moment. Her first official public appearance of that year came in June when she joined the royal family at Trooping the Colour. Ahead of that appearance, she released a message updating the public on her condition, describing a treatment process filled with what she called good days and bad days, days where she felt weak and tired, and days where she felt strong enough to make the most of feeling well. She spoke about learning patience, about listening to her body, about allowing herself the time she needed to heal. That single appearance at Trooping the Colour became one of the most talked about royal moments of the year. Photographers captured her smiling from the carriage procession, visibly thinner, visibly tired, but present. For a public that had spent months worrying about her, simply seeing her alive and smiling meant everything. It was a reminder that even the most protected family in Britain isn't immune to the same fears and struggles as everyone else. Her treatment, she said at the time, was ongoing and would continue for several more months. There was no promise of a quick recovery, no rush to project false positivity, just an honest acknowledgement that healing takes time. That kind of candor stood out precisely because it was so unusual coming from someone in her position. Royal statements are typically polished to a shine, stripped of anything that might sound uncertain or vulnerable. Catherine's message broke from that pattern in a way that resonated far beyond royal watchers and tabloid readers. Cancer patients and their families, people who had never followed the monarchy closely before, found themselves quoting her words back to each other in support groups and online communities, recognizing their own experiences in her description of good days and bad days. In an institution built for centuries on projecting strength and continuity, this was something different, a senior royal admitting, in her own words, that she was still learning how to cope. By September 2024, Catherine confirmed she had finished chemotherapy, describing herself in a statement as cancer-free at that stage of her treatment. It was a moment of relief for a family that had spent the better part of a year navigating one crisis after another, from health scares to public scrutiny to the ordinary pressures of raising 3 young children in the spotlight. But cancer-free didn't mean the story was over. There was still a long road of monitoring, recovery, and adjustment ahead. The palace, and Catherine herself, remained cautious about declaring victory too soon. That caution reflected something many families touched by cancer understand instinctively: the reluctance to celebrate too loudly before the follow-up scans, the checkups, the months of watching and waiting that come after active treatment ends. Finishing chemotherapy is a milestone, but it isn't the finish line, and nobody around Catherine seemed willing to pretend otherwise, not to the public, and from everything reported at the time, not to themselves either. That caution paid off. In January 2025, nearly a year after the surgery that started everything, Catherine made an unannounced visit to the Royal Marsden Hospital in Chelsea, London. It was there that she shared the news so many people had been waiting to hear. She was in remission. In a heartfelt statement, she thanked the hospital staff for looking after her during the most difficult year of her life, describing her gratitude to everyone who had quietly stood beside her and her husband as they navigated the ordeal together. During that same visit, she opened up about just how difficult chemotherapy had been, calling it really tough, and revealing to one patient that she had grown surprisingly attached to the port used for her treatment. It was a small, human detail, the kind of thing that made her feel less like a distant royal figure and more like anyone else who has walked through a cancer diagnosis and come out the other side forever changed. The remission announcement was followed by a message of relief and renewed focus. She wrote about looking forward to a fulfilling year ahead, about taking each day as it comes, about adjusting to what she called a new normal. For millions of people who have faced similar diagnoses, either themselves or through a loved one, her words resonated deeply. This wasn't polished palace messaging. It was the language of someone who had genuinely been through something life-altering and was still finding her footing on the other side of it. That honesty extended into how she approached her return to work as well. There was no press conference declaring herself back to full strength, no calendar suddenly packed wall-to-wall with engagements designed to prove a point. Instead, there was restraint, a conscious decision to let the pace of her recovery dictate the pace of her public life, rather than the other way around. For a family whose entire existence plays out under constant observation, that kind of restraint takes a particular kind of discipline. It would have been easy to rush back, to try to reclaim lost time, to answer months of speculation with a flurry of visible activity. Catherine chose the opposite path, and in hindsight, it's hard to argue she chose wrong. There is something worth sitting with in that detail about the port, the small medical device used to deliver chemotherapy directly into her bloodstream. Most people who haven't gone through cancer treatment never think twice about something like that. But for those who have, it becomes strangely familiar, almost a companion through the hardest months of their lives, and its removal can carry an odd mixture of relief and loss. Catherine choosing to share that specific, unglamorous detail with a stranger at the hospital said more about who she is beneath the title than almost anything else she has said publicly. It wasn't a headline-grabbing soundbite. It was the kind of thing you say to someone you trust understands exactly what you mean, because they have likely felt something similar themselves. Slowly, carefully, Catherine began to resume her public duties. She never rushed it. Even after announcing remission, she stuck to what was described as a light program of engagements, choosing appearances selectively rather than diving back into a packed royal calendar. This is where the numbers start to tell a striking story. In 2025, the hardest working member of the royal family, by a wide margin, was King Charles, who completed 535 public appearances despite managing his own cancer treatment throughout the year. Prince William followed with 202 engagements. Princess Anne, long celebrated as the family's tireless workhorse, remained near the top of the list, as she has for decades. But Catherine, still rebuilding her strength and prioritizing her children, ranked just 10th on that list, with only 68 public engagements across the entire year. It was a modest number for a future queen consort, but it wasn't a number born of reluctance. It was a number born of survival, of a woman choosing her family and her health over the demands of a public role that would always be waiting for her when she was ready. The contrast between Catherine's careful pace and Princess Anne's relentless work ethic says a great deal about two very different chapters of the same family story. Anne has spent more than 5 decades as one of the most consistently active working royals in the family's modern history. She has built a reputation, deserved many times over, as someone who simply shows up, rain or shine, headline or no headline, decade after decade. She isn't chasing attention. She has never needed to. Her approach to royal duty has always been about steady, unglamorous service, the kind that rarely trends online but keeps the institution functioning behind the scenes. In many ways, Anne represents one end of the spectrum inside the modern monarchy, defined by decades of quiet consistency. Catherine, meanwhile, represents something different this past year, a story of someone forced by circumstance to step back completely, then rebuild her public life, piece by piece, on her own terms and her own timeline. Even Anne hasn't been immune to setbacks of her own. In the summer of 2024, while Catherine was still deep in treatment, Buckingham Palace announced that Anne herself had suffered a concussion and other minor injuries, reportedly after being struck by a horse near her Gloucestershire estate. She was hospitalized as a precaution and forced to postpone a string of engagements, including a planned trip to Canada. At 73 years old, the incident was a reminder that even the family's most durable working royal isn't invincible. She made a full recovery and returned to her usual demanding schedule not long after. But for a brief moment, 2 of the family's most visible women were both sidelined by health scares at the very same time, one from an accident, the other from an illness that had reshaped her entire year. As 2025 rolled into 2026, the signs of Catherine's gradual return became increasingly visible. Royal watchers and commentators following the family closely began noting a shift in her calendar, describing an expectation that her schedule would grow busier as the year went on. She wasn't racing back to King Charles or Prince William-style workloads, and nobody close to the family expected her to. Her priority remained clear, keeping life as stable and normal as possible for her 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, even as her own public role expanded. Still, even without a packed calendar, several of her appearances in early 2026 carried real symbolic weight. One of those moments came in April, when Kensington Palace confirmed that Catherine would take part in Anzac Day commemorations across London alongside Princess Anne. It was a rare instance of the 2 women appearing at connected, coordinated royal events on the very same day, each representing the family in a different corner of the capital. Anne attended the dawn service held at Wellington Arch near Hyde Park Corner, continuing the tradition of early morning remembrance that has long defined Anzac Day ceremonies. Later that same morning, Catherine took part in the wreath-laying ceremony and parade at the cenotaph, placing a wreath on behalf of King Charles, before attending a service of commemoration and thanksgiving at Westminster Abbey. For a family that had spent nearly 2 years dealing with overlapping health crises, seeing 2 of its senior women carry out coordinated public duties on the same historic day felt like a meaningful marker of stability returning, even if only for one carefully organized morning. By June, Catherine's comeback reached what many royal commentators considered its most symbolic moment yet, her return to Royal Ascot. This wasn't just another public appearance. Ascot has long been one of the most photographed events on the royal calendar, a dazzling showcase of fashion, tradition, and generations of the family gathered together in one place. Catherine had been expected to attend the year before, in 2025, but cancelled at the last minute, still too newly returned to public duties to commit to something so visible and so demanding. Her absence that year was quietly understood, a sign that recovery doesn't move in a straight line, and that even after announcing remission, some days still call for caution over ambition. So when Catherine finally did step out at Ascot in June 2026, it carried extra emotional weight. She arrived in a bespoke Roxana dress, and those who saw her in person and on camera described her as visibly glowing, a striking contrast to the tired, thinner figure so many remembered from her Trooping the Color appearance 2 years earlier. It wasn't just about the outfit or the occasion. It was about what her presence represented, a woman who had spent 2 years fighting privately for her health, finally standing in public again at one of the most visible events in the entire royal calendar, looking healthy, looking present, looking like herself again. Meanwhile, elsewhere at the same event, Princess Anne arrived in her own traditional style, continuing her own decades-long presence at Ascot, a reminder that, even as one generation works to reclaim its footing, another continues its steady, uninterrupted march of service in the background. The broader royal family, of course, wasn't standing still while all of this unfolded. Throughout the same period, the family was dealing with an entirely separate and much more turbulent story, the fallout surrounding the former Prince Andrew and his ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson. Both were stripped of their remaining royal titles following renewed scrutiny over their association with Jeffrey Epstein, and reports throughout the year described the two of them preparing to vacate Royal Lodge, their longtime residence. Insiders close to the family described this saga as exhausting, a story that wore down the entire household, adding yet another layer of pressure onto a family already trying to manage 2 years of health crises among its most senior working members. For Catherine specifically, some reports suggested the ongoing scandal only added to an already difficult period of readjustment, as she balanced her own return to public life against a backdrop of fresh controversy swirling around other branches of the family. It's worth pausing here to separate what is confirmed from what remains speculation, because plenty of tabloid narratives have tried to layer extra drama on top of an already emotional story. There have been persistent rumors this year about tension between Catherine and Queen Camilla, some of it tracing back to a widely discussed moment during a state visit, where Camilla was claimed by some observers to have appeared to usher Catherine away during a conversation with a foreign dignitary. That claim has been disputed by others who were present, and no palace source has ever confirmed any rift between the two women. Reports describing so-called open warfare between them remain firmly in the category of unverified insider gossip, the kind that circulates constantly around any prominent family, royal or otherwise. What is verified, however, is far more grounded and, in many ways, far more compelling than any manufactured feud. It's the simple, human story of a woman who nearly disappeared from public life entirely, who fought through a diagnosis she never asked for, and who spent 2 full years rebuilding her strength one careful appearance at a time. Looking at Catherine's journey from that first quiet church walk at Sandringham in December 2023 to her glowing return at Ascot in June 2026 reveals something the tabloid headlines often miss entirely. This wasn't a straight line. It wasn't a simple story of diagnosis, treatment, and triumphant return. It was messy and uncertain, filled with canceled appearances, quiet years, honest admissions about bad days alongside the good ones, and a family that had to learn, in real time, how to be publicly present while privately vulnerable. Catherine never pretended the journey was easy. She spoke openly about being tired, about needing rest, about learning patience with uncertainty. That honesty, more than any single public appearance, may be what defined this entire chapter of her life. Meanwhile, Princess Anne's story throughout the same period served almost as a quiet counterpoint. While Catherine's return unfolded in careful, symbolic steps, Anne simply kept doing what she has always done, showing up, working, representing the family across countless engagements most people will never read a headline about. Her own brief health scare in 2024 barely slowed her down. She has spent decades proving that consistency, not visibility, is what sustains an institution like the monarchy over the long run. In many ways, the two women represent 2 different models of royal duty existing side by side within the same family, one built on decades of unbroken routine, the other built on resilience through interruption and return. Neither model is more valuable than the other, and it would be a mistake to read the story as some kind of competition between them, the tireless veteran against the recovering newcomer. If anything, the 2 approaches complement each other, filling different roles within an institution that depends on both steady continuity and occasional moments of visible renewal. Anne's decades of unglamorous consistency keep the machinery running in the background, the ribbon cuttings, the regimental visits, the charity patronages that never make headlines, but sustain relationships built over generations. Catherine's slower, more symbolic return serves a different function entirely, offering the public a human story they can connect with, a reminder that even the most protected family in the country faces the same fears, the same waiting rooms, the same fragile hope that comes with a diagnosis and a treatment plan. There's also something worth noting about how differently the 2 women have been covered by the press. Anne has largely avoided the kind of intense tabloid scrutiny that has followed Catherine since her earliest days with William, with reporters focusing on the substance of her work rather than her wardrobe. Catherine's experience has been the opposite, with every outfit and every absence dissected in detail. That difference in scrutiny may help explain why her cancer journey unfolded the way it did, with speculation filling the silence before her diagnosis became known, and why her eventual return carried so much visible weight. As 2026 continues, all indications point toward Catherine's public role expanding gradually rather than dramatically. Nobody close to the family expects her to suddenly match King Charles or Prince William in terms of raw appearance numbers, and nobody within the palace seems to want that either. Her health and her role as a mother to 3 young children will likely continue shaping how much of her calendar is devoted to public duty versus private family life. But the trajectory is clear. from 68 appearances in a deeply difficult 25 to a visibly busier and more symbolically significant string of engagements throughout 2026. Catherine's comeback has been steady, deliberate, and quietly powerful in a way that no scripted comeback tour could ever manufacture. What makes this story worth telling isn't scandal, and it isn't manufactured conflict between royal women who, by every available account, simply attended coordinated events together in service of the same family and the same institution. What makes it worth telling is far simpler than that. It's the image of a mother, diagnosed with cancer at a young age, choosing to speak about it publicly despite belonging to a family famous for saying as little as possible. It's the image of a woman describing good days and bad days with total honesty, rather than hiding behind curated statements. It's the image of her standing in a hospital corridor a year after remission, thanking the people who helped save her life, not because there were cameras waiting outside, but because gratitude, real gratitude, doesn't need an audience to matter. And it's the image of two very different women, decades apart in age and experience, standing at connected ceremonies on the same April morning in London, each representing a family that has weathered scandal, illness, and public scrutiny. And somehow, through all of it, kept showing up. That is the real story behind Catherine's return in 2026. Not a clash, not a feud, just resilience, quietly rebuilt, one careful public appearance at a time. It's worth remembering, too, that stories like this rarely have a single tidy ending. Cancer recovery doesn't work on a schedule that fits neatly into a headline or a highlight reel. There will likely be more quiet years ahead, more moments where Catherine steps back from public view to focus on her family, her health, or simply the ordinary demands of raising 3 children who are growing up faster than any of us realize. There will also, almost certainly, be more high-profile appearances like Ascot, more symbolic moments that draw attention, not because they are dramatic, but because they represent continuity, presence, a family carrying on despite everything it has faced. The real measure of this story isn't found in any single event. It's found in the pattern across 2.5 years, a pattern of retreat, honesty, treatment, gratitude, and gradual, careful return. For Princess Anne, the pattern looks different, but tells its own quiet story of endurance. She has spent more than 50 years proving that showing up again and again without needing recognition for it is its own form of strength. Her brief scare in 2024 barely interrupted that rhythm. By the time Catherine was ready to step back into public life in a meaningful way, Anne was already there, waiting, as she so often has been throughout her decades of service, ready to stand beside the next generation as it finds its own footing. Perhaps that's the most honest way to describe what happened across these 2 remarkable years. Not fury, not confrontation, not some manufactured public clash designed to generate outrage and clicks. Just 2 women from different generations, each carrying their own version of what it means to serve a family and an institution that rarely allows anyone inside it a truly private life. One never stopped working. The other stopped completely, faced something no headline could ever fully capture, and slowly, deliberately found her way back. Their stories crossed paths on a cold April morning at the Cenotaph and at Wellington Arch, and again beneath the summer sun at Ascot in June, not as rivals, but as 2 members of the same family, each doing what they could, in their own way, to keep showing up for the people who were watching and for each other. That, in the end, is the real headline. Not fury, not feud. Just 2 women, decades apart, proving that resilience often looks like showing up one more time than anyone expected.